Earlier video, we discussed the importance of determining one's cost of production for their cow-calf operation. In this video, we will expand on the topic of cost of production and deal more specifically with low-cost producers. Just to recap, what is cost of production? It is a tabulation of producers' production costs for their cow-calf operation. Production costs include winter feed, grazing, vet expenses, mineral and salt. Collectively, these are known as direct costs, and indirect costs, such as repairs, fuel, utilities, labor, depreciation. Production costs for a cow-calf operation are typically expressed as dollars per cow or dollars per pound of calf weaned. The nice thing about expressing costs as dollars per pound of calf weaned is that this also then becomes the average price a producer needs to sell their calves for in order to break even. The formula behind cost of production is revenues minus production costs equals profit. The primary revenue source for a cow-calf producer is the sale of their weaned calves. Now, Western Beef has been helping producers determine their cost of production since the late 1990s. Currently, it is offered free to producers, with the understanding that their individual results will be aggregated into averages and shared with the industry. If we take a look at the breakdown of production costs, we find that feed, bedding, and pasture costs are the largest costs for a cow-calf operation, and they tend to be in the range of 60% of total production costs. The next largest category is yardage. So what we feed and how we feed accounts for about 75% of the annual cost of maintaining a cow herd. This is why there's been a consistent message to cow-calf producers of the importance to minimize costs by focusing on what is fed and how it is fed. Producers are encouraged to test their feed and use feed test results to create balanced rations for their cow herd. They're encouraged to minimize the use of pens to feed their cows during the winter and to utilize systems like swath grazing, bale grazing, and straw chaff pile grazing. They're also encouraged to do things like maximize the use of their pasture through rotational grazing and stockpile grazing. In our annual cost of production, we like to compare the low-cost producers to the study averages and then use those findings to draw inferences about what constitutes a low-cost producer. In our most recent study, the low-cost producers had larger herd sizes, which is no surprise. They were nearly twice as large as the average producer in the study. They had slightly lower winter feeding days. That didn't make as big of a decision as it has in the past. And ultimately, the low-cost producers had $100 per cow lower cost than the average producer. So the low-cost producers in our study, as I just mentioned, they have larger herd sizes, at least 300 cows. They tend to calve in late spring with April-May calving start dates. They often retain their calves after weaning and background them. They all minimize the amount of behind-the-barn feeding or dry lot pen feeding and use some type of field feeding, like swath grazing or bale grazing, straw chaff grazing, for part of their winter feeding program. The low-cost producers also tend to have lower investment in machinery and buildings and lower debt. Interestingly, low-cost producers can be from any part of the province. They're not from a certain part of the province or a certain soil zone. Low-cost producers can come from all over Saskatchewan. Also, silage was used by some of these low-cost producers as part of the winter feeding ration. And I only mention this because silage tends to get a bad rep as being a high-cost feedstuff, but it can work well for some operations, especially in situations where the producer has a feedlot operation in addition to their cow-calf operation, and they own the equipment to make silage as opposed to having some sort of custom silaging crew come in and make the silage for them. Winter feeding days in the most recent study were not significantly different between the average producer and the low-cost producers. In the past, the difference has been as high as 40 days, and so we're going to take this narrowing of winter feeding days between the low-cost and the average producer as a sign that cow-calf producers in general are realizing the importance of minimizing winter feeding and by extending the grazing season and incorporating extensive feeding systems. The areas where low-cost producers do not cut corners is pasture, bulls, and herd health. Now, pasture, it's the cheapest feed source for your cow herd. Do things like rotational graze and stockpile graze to make the most of your pasture. Bulls make up 50% of the genetics of your calf crop, so make sure you're making wise choices for that herd sire for your cows. Herd health through a vaccination and mineral program. is very, very important for your herd. And spending less on any of these three expense categories can ultimately reduce herd productivity and lead to increased costs. So to summarize, the path to becoming a low-cost producer involves determining your cost of production and then comparing your costs against benchmarks to determine, are you low cost or are you high cost? Do things like test your feed and balance your rations. That feed is one of the highest costs of your maintaining your cows. Keep winter feeding out of the yard and incorporate extensive feeding during the winter feeding period. Do not overinvest in assets. Lots of iron will cost you in depreciation, repairs, and interest if you're purchasing those items through financing. And increase your herd size if you can. The low-cost producers averaged over 500 head per herd. Lastly, do not compromise on herd health. You need your cows to produce year over year, so you need to give them vaccinations and mineral supplementation so that they can perform for you. For more information on Western beef, please visit us at www.wbdc.sk.ca or email info.wbdc@pami.ca.